Gummy bear candy on a hike is a lot like a broom tree in the desert. Let me explain. This past week, I finally carved out a window of time to do what I love most, go for a hike in the mountains. So I took the kids and we drove east on I-90 for a while, stopping at the trailhead that leads to Talapis, Olali, and Pratt Lakes. Have some of you been there before? Yeah. The moderate hike I had planned turned into an 8.5-mile trek on a lollipop trail that climbed more than 2,200 feet in elevation. It was not a walk in the park. No, I don't know about you, but I started conditioning my children to love what I love when they were very small. I have always bribed them on hikes with candy, usually gummy bears, a small burst of sugar and sweetness to lure them up the steepest switchbacks, and it has worked. When nerves are beginning to fray and enthusiasm waning, I pull out the gummy bears in a smile, and they keep walking. As we continued our upward march, it started to sound a little like the Israelites in the wilderness. I may be exaggerating a little. Why, oh why, have you brought us out into the wilderness to die? We would rather go back to slavery in Egypt than endure 25 more switchbacks with the mosquitoes, more gummy bears. The wilderness metaphor works well, both literally and figuratively. The wilderness is a place of giving and testing. In the wilderness, we experience provision and the need for obedience. It can be a time of physical weakness and even despair. And it can be an occasion of spiritual strengthening and personal redefinition. In today's reading from 1 Kings, Elijah longs for death. But why? To help jog your memory, Elijah is God's prophet living in the 9th century BCE in Israel. Now, historically, this was a time of relative peace and prosperity for the Israelites. The tension lies between the worshipers of God and the royally patronized worship of Baal. And we have Queen Jezebel, married to King Ahab, and she is a fierce follower of Baal. And she violently persecutes Elijah and others who worship God. Elijah also represents the new Moses because he withstands royal oppression and preserves the faith, and for this he is tyrannized. Now Elijah is running away from Jezebel and he flees to the deserts. And this is the first night in what will become a 40-day journey into the wilderness before he reaches Mount Horeb and sees God. Elijah goes a full day's journey into the wilderness. He sits down under a solitary broom tree and asks to die. But instead of death, Elijah finds God, the gentle touch of an angel, and divine provision. To quote Thomas R. Stiegald, there is gracious provision even when the beneficiaries neither ask nor understand. I'll say that again. There is gracious provision even when the beneficiaries neither ask nor understand. This is God's grace. Grace. This is the sure and certain knowledge that God cares for us and God sustains us when we ask and when we don't ask. We are recipients of God's grace even when we are unaware or uncomprehending. I would say that it is God's grace that has led me back to Epiphany. When I left 7 years ago, never in my wildest dreams could I have imagined being a candidate for bishop in this diocese, losing an election, and ending up back here with you. By the grace of God, I have returned to Epiphany, eager to serve Christ and his church here in your midst. Now, I bet that each of you can think of a time in your life in which you have been the recipient of God's grace. It may have taken you a while to even figure it out, and that's okay. Elijah receives God's grace in the desert. He is in despair, running for his life. He journeys into the wilderness to escape the pressure. Elijah is fleeing the anxieties of his socio-political world and its power plays. He is running from Jezebel, and he runs, and he runs, and he runs. He runs until he flings himself under the patchy shade of a broom tree, broken and afraid. And it is here that he meets God once more. A broom tree is a desert shrub found in the Middle East, and it has deep, deep roots to draw in moisture in a barren place. Broom trees appear throughout the Bible, and when they do, they are typically moments of despair and times of divine encounter. Job. You remember the story of Job. Job encounters a broom tree and describes it as a place of desolation, ruin, and abandonment. And the broom tree appears in the Psalms described as a place for mourning and distress. And here in 1 Kings, under a broom tree, Elijah finds God and meets an angel. And that is why gummy bear candy on a hike is a lot like a broom tree in the desert. Now, I am definitely not equating gummy bears to God. I want to be clear on that. But I am saying that the gummy bear on a hike is a moment of provision and care. It strengthens a weary hiker for the journey, just as the patchy shade of the broom tree strengthens Elijah. Now, it's a summer Sunday morning in August. It's warm outside, and I imagine some of you may be longing for a broom tree right about now. You want to rest in its shade, and perhaps you're dreaming of a hot cake delivered by an angel. Coffee hour might do the trick, and if not, I have a solution. I have a party favor for this sermon this morning. I have some gummy bears to get you through the sermon. I'm going to ask Pam and the ushers to help me with this. Thank you. They've got some up front too, don't worry. So I'm going to ask you to pass these around, to take some if you would like, share a bag with your neighbor, whatever you would like. And as we pass these around, I want you to think about this. May these gummy bears represent God's grace. May they be a reminder of God's tremendous provision and care, just like the hotcakes and water delivered by an angel to Elijah in that desert. So as they are passed around, I encourage you to go ahead, open them, eat a few gummy bears, and we'll wrap this up. The wilderness metaphor works well. The wilderness is a place of giving and testing. In the wilderness, we experience provision and the need for obedience. The wilderness can be a time of physical weakness and even despair, and it can be an occasion of spiritual strengthening and personal redefinition. Now, if you think back to reading the Old Testament or hearing it, throughout the Old Testament, people experience God in a myriad of ways, right? In the early days of Genesis, it's a voice people hear. They talk to God. And then as we move through the Old Testament and through time, people experience God in fire or wind. And finally, experiences of God become a little bit more elusive or ethereal. It is the feeling of God's presence. Whereas Elijah finds God at Mount Horeb in the verses immediately following what we heard today, I'm going to read you just a couple of verses. It says, "Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence." The St. John's Bible illumination for this passage shows this moment, and it is here in front so you can look at it this morning. It is a vibrant and stunning image there, and Elijah is teeny tiny and in green at the bottom. Elijah being overcome by the presence of God in the silence. And the silence is depicted there in gold, silver, and an array of warm colors. And along the bottom of the illumination, it says, "And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence." Sometimes we need a few gummy bears or a broom tree in the desert to help us settle our souls enough to see God. Let us learn from Elijah and his histrionics and accept that God's grace, God's provision and care are ever with us.